The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty landscape of the American Southwest. A column of weary figures trudged towards a cluster of low-slung buildings, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the afternoon heat. These were German prisoners of war, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and resentment. They had traveled far, from the battlefields of Europe to this remote corner of America, their world reduced to the confines of a prisoner of war camp. The camp itself was a stark and desolate place. Barbed wire fences encircled a collection of simple wooden barracks, a mess hall, and a few other utilitarian structures. The surrounding terrain offered little comfort: scrub brush, rocky soil, and the ever-present sun. It was a far cry from the green fields and forests of their homeland, a landscape that seemed to mirror the bleakness of their situation. This was not the European prison they had envisioned, not the stone walls and damp cells of their nightmares, but an entirely different kind of confinement, one that felt both alien and unsettling. The initial reaction among the German soldiers was one of profound unease. They had heard stories, propaganda fueled by years of war, painting Americans as ruthless and vengeful. They expected harsh treatment, brutal guards, and a life of misery. The reality, at least at first, was more subtle, but no less unsettling. The guards were stoic and watchful, their faces unreadable. The silence of the desert seemed to amplify their anxiety, a constant reminder of their isolation and vulnerability. Their preconceived notions were deeply ingrained. They were soldiers, trained to fight and to hate the enemy. They had been told that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and decadent. Now, as they stood within the confines of this prison camp, they braced themselves for the worst, clinging to the familiar narratives that had sustained them through the war. Their defeat felt raw, their future uncertain. Overseeing this group of prisoners was Sergeant Miller, an American guard whose weariness ran deeper than the lines on his face. He had seen enough of war, enough of death and destruction. He longed for the day when he could return home, to his family, to a life of peace and normalcy. He viewed these prisoners not as monsters, but as men, caught in the same tragic circumstances as himself. He carried the burden of responsibility, but also a flicker of hope that even in this desolate place, some semblance of humanity could prevail. As the prisoners were led to their assigned barracks, a sense of foreboding settled over them. They were uncertain of what awaited them, of the rules they would have to follow, of the treatment they would receive. The shadow of war hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the conflict that had brought them to this place. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the camp, a silent promise of the long and uncertain days to come. The sun beat down on the barbed wire fences, baking the dusty earth a relentless brown. Inside the compound, the German prisoners shuffled through their day, a monotonous cycle dictated by the harsh realities of captivity. Breakfast was a meager affair of stale bread and watery coffee, swallowed in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Work details followed, dragging them out into the unforgiving landscape to clear brush and perform minor construction tasks. The labor was hard, the sun relentless, and the guards watchful. Communication was a constant struggle. The language barrier loomed large, a wall between captor and captive. Simple requests became exercises in frustration, often ending in misunderstandings and heightened tensions. The American guards, many of them young and inexperienced, struggled to understand the prisoners' needs, while the Germans, in turn, viewed their captors with suspicion and resentment. Small acts of kindness were rare, almost imperceptible. A guard sharing a cigarette, a few extra moments of rest during a break, these tiny gestures were scrutinized and debated amongst the prisoners, analyzed for hidden meanings. Were they genuine acts of compassion, or simply a calculated attempt to lull them into a false sense of security? Rumors circulated constantly, whispered in hushed tones during work details or under the cover of darkness in the barracks. Some spoke of brutal interrogations and harsh punishments in other camps, fueling their fears. Others clung to the hope of a swift end to the war and a return home to their families. Among the prisoners were a few distinct figures. There was Hans, a young soldier barely out of his teens, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. He longed for his family, haunted by the memories of the battles he had witnessed. An older officer, disillusioned and weary, carried himself with a quiet dignity, his face etched with the scars of war. He had seen too much death and destruction and seemed to have lost all hope. Then there was the hardened veteran, a man who had known nothing but conflict his entire adult life. He was cynical and bitter, expecting nothing but the worst from his captors. He viewed any act of kindness with suspicion, convinced it was merely a prelude to some form of cruelty. As the days turned into weeks, a sense of monotony settled over the camp. The prisoners fell into a routine, their lives reduced to a series of repetitive tasks. The initial fear and resentment began to give way to a dull sense of resignation. The endless hours spent clearing brush under the scorching sun, the meager meals, the constant surveillance, it all weighed heavily on their spirits. Yet, even in this bleak environment, a flicker of hope remained. The relative lack of overt brutality, the occasional act of kindness, the rumors of better treatment in other camps, these small things kept the flame alive, fueling their desire for a better future. They wondered what tomorrow would bring, if there was a possibility of better treatment, or if the monotony and frustration would continue to grind them down. The unspoken question hung in the air: could they find any shred of humanity in this desolate place? The injured prisoner, a young man named Klaus, was taken to the camp's rudimentary medical facility. It wasn't a hospital by any stretch of the imagination, more like a small, sparsely equipped room. The camp doctor, a weary man with tired eyes and a perpetually furrowed brow, examined Klaus's leg. The examination was thorough, professional, and surprisingly gentle. Klaus had expected rough handling, perhaps even a callous disregard for his pain. Instead, the doctor spoke to him in broken German, offering words of reassurance and explaining the treatment in simple terms. The doctor cleaned the wound with antiseptic, carefully bandaged it, and prescribed rest. The experience was unsettling for Klaus. It challenged everything he thought he knew about the enemy. He had envisioned a brutal interrogation, perhaps even torture. Instead, he received competent medical care and a modicum of human kindness. The food also proved to be a surprise. It wasn't gourmet cuisine, of course, but it was far better than the meager rations he had expected. There was bread, often slightly stale, but still filling. There was stew, sometimes watery, but containing chunks of meat and vegetables. There were even occasional servings of fruit, usually apples or oranges, a rare treat that reminded him of home. The portions were generous, enough to satisfy even the hungriest soldier. The prisoners were used to near-starvation conditions in their own army. This was luxurious in comparison. The daily experience of decent food chipping away at their perception of Americans as cruel and unfeeling. Sergeant Miller, the American guard in charge, began making small, almost imperceptible gestures of goodwill. He would share an extra ration of coffee, a precious commodity in the camp. He would allow them a few extra minutes of recreation time, a brief respite from the monotony of their confinement. He would even try to engage them in simple conversations, attempting to bridge the language barrier with gestures and smiles. These small acts of kindness, though seemingly insignificant, began to have a profound effect on the prisoners. They started to question their preconceived notions about the Americans. They began to see them not as monsters, but as fellow human beings, caught in the same tragic circumstances of war. Whispers of hope began to circulate among the prisoners. Perhaps, they cautiously speculated, their captors were not as cruel as they had initially feared. Perhaps, there was a chance for humane treatment, a chance to survive this ordeal with their dignity intact. Perhaps there was even a possibility to see the end of the conflict. These were dangerous thoughts, of course, for admitting to the possibility of human kindness was the first step towards seeing the other side as human too. That was a psychological bridge few were willing to cross, but cracks were beginning to form in their hardened hearts. The glimmer of something other than hate, despair and fear had begun. Perhaps survival in the camp could be more than existence, but something closer to life. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The air of palpable tension began to ease, the wariness began to lessen, and the resentment began to fade. Tex was a figure unlike any they had encountered thus far. He wasn't a soldier, not really. He wore a Stetson hat, perpetually tilted back on his head, and his drawl was so thick it was nearly impenetrable. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a stark contrast to the hurried movements of the guards and the shuffling feet of the prisoners. He was a cook, they learned, though cowboy cook seemed a more fitting title. He handled the massive camp stove with an easy confidence, his movements economical and precise. At first, the prisoners watched him warily. Was this some new form of psychological torment? Was he going to poison their food? But Tex seemed oblivious to their distrust. He'd hum quietly to himself as he stirred massive pots of stew or flipped stacks of pancakes, seemingly content in his own world. He was a constant presence, a fixture of their daily lives, yet he remained an enigma. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't overtly friendly either. He simply was. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Tex began to interact. At first, it was just a nod of his head or a grunt of acknowledgement. But soon, he was attempting to communicate. He'd point to objects, saying the English word slowly and deliberately, as if speaking to a child. The prisoners, equally hesitant, would respond with the German equivalent, creating a clumsy, stilted dialogue. It was frustrating and often comical, but it was a start. Tex noticed Hans, the young soldier who always seemed to be sketching in a small notebook. He watched him for a while, then pointed to the drawing of a horse. Horse, Tex said slowly, enunciating each syllable. Hans, understanding, replied, fared. Tex grinned, a flash of white teeth against his sun-weathered face. Fared, he repeated, butchering the pronunciation but clearly making an effort. He discovered that several of the prisoners had experience with horses and farming back in Germany. This seemed to pique his interest. He started bringing them small tasks, like helping him chop vegetables or carry firewood. These were menial jobs, but they offered a welcome distraction from the monotony of camp life. As they worked, Tex would tell them stories about his life on the ranch, about cattle drives and rodeos. The prisoners, in turn, would share stories of their farms and families back home. Sometimes, Tex would sneak them extra scraps of food, a piece of bacon, a crust of bread. Small gestures, but they spoke volumes. He taught them simple phrases in English: howdy, thank you, good morning. He even tried to learn a few words in German, much to their amusement. His attempts were often disastrous, but they appreciated the effort. It was an act of genuine kindness, a gesture of humanity in a place defined by inhumanity. The prisoners were bewildered. They had expected hatred and contempt, but instead, they were met with this quiet, unassuming cowboy who treated them with a strange mixture of indifference and compassion. What was his game? Was this some elaborate trick? They couldn't quite figure him out. This cowboy cook was an anomaly. Tex, with a twinkle in his eye, started teaching the prisoners about the American West. He showed them pictures of cowboys riding horses, herding cattle, and living a life seemingly far removed from the horrors of war. He spoke of vast plains, open skies, and the spirit of independence that defined the cowboy. The prisoners, in turn, shared stories of their own lives back in Germany. They talked about their families, their farms, their cities, and the traditions that shaped their culture. They described the foods they missed, the music they loved, and the landscapes they longed to see again. These conversations, though often halting and filled with misunderstandings, began to chip away at the wall of stereotypes that had separated them. The prisoners learned that not all Americans were the cruel, heartless people they had imagined. Tex, in his simple, unassuming way, embodied a different kind of American, one who was kind, generous, and open-minded. Tex, in turn, discovered that the German soldiers were not all fanatical Nazis. Many were simply young men caught up in a war they didn't fully understand, yearning for peace and a return to their loved ones. A tentative friendship began to blossom between Tex and a small group of prisoners. They would often gather in the evenings, sharing stories, teaching each other words in their respective languages, and laughing at their shared mistakes. Hans, the young soldier who had arrived at the camp filled with fear and resentment, found himself drawn to Tex's warmth and genuine interest in his well-being. He started to see Tex as a father figure, someone he could trust and confide in. Sergeant Miller, observing these interactions from a distance, couldn't help but notice the positive impact Tex was having on the prisoners' morale. The atmosphere in the camp was noticeably lighter, and the prisoners seemed more cooperative and less resentful. He realized that Tex's simple acts of kindness were doing more to ease tensions and promote understanding than any official policy or regulation could. However, suspicion still lingered. Some of the prisoners found it difficult to believe that Tex's kindness was genuine. They wondered if it was some kind of trick, a subtle form of psychological warfare designed to weaken their resolve. Others worried about what their fellow prisoners would think if they were seen fraternizing with the enemy. Despite these concerns, the seeds of trust had been planted. The prisoners were beginning to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as human beings with their own hopes, fears, and dreams. They were starting to realize that despite their differences, they shared a common humanity that transcended national borders and political ideologies. The transformation was slow, subtle, and often fraught with setbacks, but it was undeniable. The Cowboy Cookout, still just a distant possibility, began to represent something more than just a meal. It was a symbol of hope, a promise of understanding, and a testament to the power of human connection to overcome even the most deeply ingrained prejudices. It was a fragile hope, easily shattered, but it was there nonetheless, flickering like a candle in the darkness of war. Tex's idea seemed simple enough on the surface, a cowboy cookout. He envisioned it as a way to share a piece of American culture with the prisoners, something far removed from the battlefield and the harsh realities of their confinement. He wanted them to experience the warmth of a campfire, the taste of barbecue, and the camaraderie of a shared meal. He saw it as a chance to bridge the gap between captor and captive, to show them that Americans weren't the cruel, heartless monsters they might have imagined. He hoped it would plant a seed of understanding, a glimmer of hope in the desolate landscape of their imprisonment. But Sergeant Miller, despite his own growing empathy for the prisoners, was hesitant. The idea, while well-intentioned, presented a multitude of potential problems. Security was paramount. Could they be certain that the prisoners wouldn't use the cookout as an opportunity to escape? Would there be enough guards to maintain order and prevent any unrest? And what about the other guards? Many of them harbored deep resentment towards the Germans, fueled by the losses they had suffered in the war. How would they react to seeing their enemies treated with such apparent kindness? Would it breed resentment and discord within the ranks? Miller also worried about the prisoners themselves. How would they interpret this gesture? Would they see it as a genuine attempt at friendship, or as a cynical ploy to manipulate them? Would they trust the Americans enough to let their guard down, to relax, and enjoy themselves? Or would they remain suspicious, convinced that there was some hidden motive behind the cookout? The potential for misunderstanding was immense. He considered the potential benefits, however. The cookout could significantly improve the prisoners' morale. A taste of something familiar, something that reminded them of home, could ease their suffering and make their confinement more bearable. It could also foster a sense of gratitude and cooperation, making them less likely to cause trouble. And perhaps most importantly, it could offer a chance for genuine cultural exchange, a chance for both prisoners and guards to see each other as human beings, not just as enemies. Miller knew he couldn't make the decision alone. He needed to seek permission from his superiors, to present the idea and argue its merits. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The military bureaucracy was notoriously resistant to change, especially when it came to matters of security and prisoner welfare. He anticipated skepticism, red tape, and a barrage of questions. He would have to convince them that the potential benefits outweighed the risks, that the cookout was not just a frivolous gesture but a worthwhile endeavor that could contribute to the overall war effort, even in some small way. He braced himself for a difficult conversation, knowing that the fate of Tex's idea, and perhaps something more profound, hung in the balance. He understood this could either greatly increase morale, or lead to total chaos and disorder. The approval process for Tex's cookout idea proved to be a labyrinthine ordeal. Sergeant Miller, despite his rank and relatively respected standing, found himself wading through layers of military bureaucracy, each level seemingly more resistant than the last. Forms needed to be filled in triplicate, justifications meticulously crafted, and potential risks exhaustively assessed. Each query was met with another demand for clarification, another layer of red tape designed, it seemed, to suffocate the very notion of goodwill. The higher-ups saw the cookout as a frivolous distraction from the serious business of war. They questioned the expenditure of resources, even the relatively minor ones required for a simple barbecue. They worried about the potential for unrest, for escape attempts, for the erosion of discipline. Miller patiently addressed each concern, arguing that improved morale among the prisoners would lead to fewer disciplinary issues and a more cooperative workforce. He stressed the potential public relations benefits, the opportunity to showcase American values of fairness and compassion, even in wartime. But his arguments often fell on deaf ears, met with skepticism and suspicion. Tex, meanwhile, was already gathering supplies, undeterred by the official inertia. He scoured the camp's kitchens for spare cuts of meat, bartering and cajoling cooks and quartermasters. He managed to secure a modest amount of flour for biscuits, some beans, and a few precious bottles of soda. He even convinced a sympathetic supply sergeant to misplace a few watermelons, claiming they were destined for a mess hall that had mysteriously burned down. Miller, while officially turning a blind eye to Tex's less-than-orthodox procurement methods, couldn't help but admire the cowboy's resourcefulness and unwavering optimism. As word of the cookout spread through the camp, it stirred a mixture of reactions among the American guards. Some were cautiously supportive, recognizing the potential benefits of improved relations with the prisoners. Others were openly hostile, viewing the idea as coddling the enemy. They grumbled about treating the Germans too well, arguing that they deserved nothing but harsh punishment for their role in the war. These dissenting voices fueled an undercurrent of tension, creating a palpable sense of unease within the ranks. Whispers of insubordination and complaints to higher authorities circulated, adding to Miller's already considerable stress. He knew he was walking a tightrope, balancing the desire to do something positive with the need to maintain order and discipline. The prisoners themselves were equally conflicted. Excitement mingled with apprehension. They couldn't quite believe that their captors would offer them such a gesture of goodwill. Was it a trap? A propaganda stunt? Or a genuine attempt at understanding? They discussed the possibilities in hushed tones, analyzing every detail of Tex's interactions, searching for hidden motives. The younger, more impressionable prisoners were eager to embrace the opportunity, while the older, more hardened veterans remained skeptical, wary of letting their guard down. Hans, torn between hope and doubt, found himself increasingly drawn to the idea, longing for a moment of normalcy amidst the chaos of war. He hoped this cookout would somehow bridge the gap between them and their captors, but deep down, a part of him feared disappointment, feared that the promise of kindness would prove to be just another illusion. The preparations for the cookout transformed a section of the camp into something almost unrecognizable. The stark, dusty ground, usually the domain of marching feet and weary laborers, was swept clean. A makeshift stage, crafted from scavenged lumber, stood ready for the promised music. The air, usually thick with the smell of dust and disinfectant, now carried the tantalizing aroma of roasting meat. It was an aroma that both intrigued and unsettled the prisoners. They had grown accustomed to the bland, monotonous meals served in the mess hall. This abundance, this open display of plenty, was something foreign and almost unbelievable. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the prisoners were led, under guard, toward the cookout area. Their faces were a study in contrasts. Some wore expressions of barely concealed excitement, their eyes wide with curiosity. Others remained stoic, their faces etched with suspicion, wary of some hidden motive. A few looked genuinely terrified, as if they were being led to some unknown punishment. The guards themselves seemed unsure, their usual stern demeanor softened by the festive atmosphere, but their vigilance remained sharp. The sounds of country music drifted on the breeze, a twangy melody that was utterly alien to most of the prisoners. They exchanged glances, their confusion palpable. The music, the smell of the food, the unfamiliar setting, it was all a sensory overload, a jarring departure from the grim reality of their imprisonment. They huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some elaborate trick? A cruel joke? Or was it, as some dared to hope, a genuine attempt at connection? As they approached the center of the activity, they saw him. Tex. He stood near the massive grill, his face beaming, a genuine smile that seemed to reach his eyes. He gestured warmly towards them, his movements relaxed and welcoming. He wore a large cowboy hat that cast a shadow over his face, but his eyes twinkled with genuine warmth. He began to speak, his voice a drawl, attempting to communicate in broken German, clearly making an effort to bridge the language barrier. His words were simple, but his intent was clear. He wanted them to feel welcome. He wanted them to enjoy themselves. The initial reaction was hesitation. The prisoners remained clustered together, unsure of how to proceed. They eyed the food, the music, and the smiling faces with a mixture of longing and distrust. Years of war and propaganda had instilled in them a deep-seated suspicion of the enemy. To accept this generosity, to let down their guard, felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of history and prejudice. It was a tense moment, a fragile balance between hope and fear. The cookout was underway, but the atmosphere remained guarded, a delicate dance between captor and captive. Would they be able to bridge the divide? Or would the weight of the past prove too heavy to overcome? The aroma, rich and unfamiliar, hung heavy in the air. It was a scent unlike anything they had encountered within the confines of the camp, a far cry from the monotonous boiled potatoes and thin broth that had become their daily fare. The prisoners, a motley collection of young conscripts and seasoned veterans, shuffled forward, their eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. They had been led from their barracks, the familiar routine broken without explanation, and the guards, usually stern and uncommunicative, had offered only vague assurances of a special event. Now, they stood on the edge of an open field, a sprawling expanse of sun-baked earth, and the source of the tantalizing smell became clear, a massive grill, laden with sizzling meat, the flames dancing beneath a canopy of smoke. The food itself was a revelation. Heaps of beef, cooked to a perfect char, sat alongside mountains of roasted potatoes, beans simmered in a smoky sauce, and cornbread, golden and sweet. It was a feast, an abundance that seemed almost obscene in the context of wartime scarcity. The prisoners, accustomed to rationing and hunger, stared in disbelief. For many, it was the first time they had seen such a display of culinary extravagance. Hesitantly, they began to fill their plates, their movements awkward and self-conscious. They ate slowly at first, savoring each bite, their senses overwhelmed by the unfamiliar flavors and textures. Tex, his face weathered and tanned, moved among them, a gentle giant with a warm smile. He gestured towards the food, encouraging them to take more, his words a mix of English and broken German. He seemed genuinely pleased to see them enjoying the meal. He began sharing stories of his life on the ranch, tales of cattle drives, rodeos, and the vast open spaces of the American West. He spoke with a drawl that was both soothing and mesmerizing, his words painting vivid pictures in their minds. Some of the prisoners tentatively shared stories of their own, tales of their families, their hometowns, and the lives they had left behind. The conversation flowed haltingly at first, punctuated by awkward silences and misunderstandings, but gradually, a sense of connection began to emerge. As the afternoon wore on, the initial apprehension faded, replaced by a sense of camaraderie. Someone produced a harmonica, and soon, the air was filled with music, a mix of American country tunes and German folk songs. The prisoners, emboldened by the food and the music, began to relax and enjoy themselves, laughing and singing along, their voices blending in a discordant but harmonious chorus. Even some of the guards, initially wary and aloof, began to join in, sharing food and stories, their faces softening with smiles. The cookout became a melting pot, a space where the lines between captor and captive blurred, where shared humanity transcended the boundaries of nationality and ideology. It was a moment of respite, a brief escape from the harsh realities of war, a reminder that beneath the uniforms and the rhetoric, they were all just people, with shared hopes, dreams, and fears. For a few precious hours, they were not enemies, but simply human beings, sharing food, music, and laughter under the warm desert sun. Hans sat quietly, the remnants of the cookout settling in his stomach, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the desert sun. He found a spot near the edge of the cookout area, slightly removed from the remaining activity, and leaned against a weathered wooden post. The sounds of the camp, usually a dull hum of routine and constraint, were muted by the lingering melodies of the cowboy songs. He watched Tex, still energetic, sharing stories and laughter with a group of guards. His thoughts drifted back to his family, to the faces of his mother and sisters, etched with worry in his memory. He pictured his little brother, playing with toy soldiers in their garden, blissfully unaware of the war raging around them. The guilt washed over him, a familiar ache in his chest. He was a soldier, yes, but he was also a son, a brother, a part of a family he might never see again. He missed the simple normalcy of their lives, the comforting routine of their days. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure the scent of his mother's baking, the warmth of their fireplace on a cold winter evening. He imagined himself back in their small town, far from the barren landscape of this American prison camp, far from the horrors of war. A wave of longing surged through him, so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He quickly wiped them away, not wanting to be seen as weak or vulnerable. Tex noticed Hans sitting alone and, excusing himself from the group, ambled over to him. He sat down beside him on the dusty ground, offering a silent, understanding presence. He didn't try to force conversation, sensing that Hans needed a moment of solitude. After a few minutes, Hans spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told Tex about his family, about his fears for their safety, about his dreams for the future. He spoke of his love for his homeland, but also of his disillusionment with the war. He described the propaganda he had believed, the promises that had led him to fight, and the crushing reality of what he had witnessed. Tex listened intently, his eyes filled with empathy. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply listened, offering a safe space for Hans to share his burden. When Hans finished, Tex placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture of solidarity. Sergeant Miller, observing from a distance, felt a profound sense of hope. He had seen so much death and destruction, so much hatred and division. The cookout, initially a risky gamble, had become a symbol of something more, a testament to the power of human connection to bridge even the widest divides. He realized that even in the midst of war, there was still room for compassion, for understanding, for the possibility of a better future. He thought about his own family, his own hopes and dreams. He knew that the world needed more moments like this, more opportunities for people to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. A shared loss, a shared hope. The setting sun cast long shadows across the camp, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple, a silent promise of a new day. 667 words. The aftermath of the cookout was palpable. The air, once thick with suspicion, now carried a different scent, a blend of shared laughter, lingering barbecue smoke, and a newfound respect that was slowly taking root. The conversations that had previously been clipped and cautious now flowed with a hesitant curiosity. The prisoners and guards, emboldened by the evening's shared experience, found themselves engaging in tentative dialogues. They were, in essence, peeling back the layers of propaganda and prejudice that had defined their interactions until now. It was in these conversations that the true challenge to preconceived notions began. The prisoners, many of whom had been fed a steady diet of anti-American sentiment, were now confronted with the reality of their captors' humanity. They heard stories of families back home, of dreams deferred by the war, and of a longing for peace that mirrored their own. The guards, in turn, listened to the prisoners' tales of hardship, loss, and the complexities of their own motivations for fighting. Hans, in particular, found himself in several lengthy discussions with Sergeant Miller. The young soldier, once so filled with resentment, now wrestled with the realization that the enemy was not a faceless monster but a collection of individuals, each with their own story to tell. He questioned the very foundation of the war, the ideologies that had driven him and his comrades to fight. Tex, with his characteristic straightforwardness, played a crucial role in these ongoing dialogues. He wasn't one for philosophical debates or political arguments. Instead, he offered simple, homespun wisdom, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with respect and understanding. He spoke of his own experiences with prejudice and the transformative power of kindness. "Treat folks how you want to be treated," he'd say, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. "Ain't no room for hate in this world. It just breeds more of the same." His words were a balm to the simmering tensions, a reminder of the shared humanity that bound them all together. The prisoners began to see past the uniforms and the barbed wire, recognizing the guards as individuals with their own struggles and aspirations. They discovered shared interests in things like music, nature, and the simple joys of life. A love for a particular song, a fascination with the local wildlife, or a shared appreciation for a well-told story, these small connections became bridges across the chasm of war. This newfound understanding didn't erase the past, nor did it magically dissolve the complexities of their situation. The prisoners were still prisoners, and the guards were still responsible for their confinement, but it did create a space for mutual respect, a recognition of each other's inherent worth as human beings. The cookout, it turned out, was more than just a meal, it was a catalyst for change, a challenge to the very foundations of prejudice and animosity. The air was thick with a slow, subtle transformation. Tex extended an invitation, a simple gesture that resonated with the weight of unspoken emotions. He beckoned one of the prisoners, a young man named Carl, to join him in a dance. Carl, initially hesitant, glanced around at his fellow prisoners, their faces a mixture of encouragement and disbelief. The music, a lively country tune, filled the air, its rhythm infectious. With a gentle nod from Tex, Carl stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. He placed his hand tentatively on Tex's shoulder, mirroring the posture he had seen in countless American westerns. Tex, with a warm smile, guided him into a simple two-step. The other prisoners watched, their eyes wide with surprise and amusement. Some began to clap along to the music, their initial apprehension melting away. As Carl and Tex moved to the music, a ripple of energy spread through the cookout. Other prisoners, emboldened by Carl's bravery, began to pair up and join in the dance. Some were awkward and clumsy, but their laughter filled the air. Even some of the guards, initially standing stiffly on the sidelines, found themselves drawn into the festivities. A few tentatively approached the prisoners, offering a hand in friendship and a chance to dance. The scene transformed into a joyous celebration of life, a temporary reprieve from the harsh realities of war. The cookout became a dance floor, a space where the barriers of language and nationality dissolved. The prisoners and guards moved together, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of the music, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the setting sun. The dance was more than just a physical activity, it was a symbolic breaking down of walls. It represented the shattering of prejudice and animosity, the dismantling of the invisible barriers that separated captors and captives. In that moment, they were not enemies, but simply human beings, sharing a common experience of joy and connection. The music transcended language, the movement transcended ideology, and the shared experience transcended the divisions of war. The energy was palpable, a tangible sense of unity and understanding. The cookout, initially conceived as a gesture of goodwill, had blossomed into something far more profound. It had become a catalyst for empathy, a bridge across cultural divides, and a testament to the enduring power of human connection. The dance, a seemingly simple act, had unlocked a wellspring of hope and understanding, reminding everyone present that even in the darkest of times, humanity could still prevail. It was an unexpected moment of levity, a shared experience that would forever alter their perceptions of each other. It was a celebration of life amidst the shadow of war, a reminder that even enemies could find common ground and shared joy. The cookout ended as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple. The air, once filled with the aroma of barbecue and the sounds of laughter, slowly quieted as the prisoners were led back to their barracks. A strange mix of emotions swirled within them, contentment, confusion, and a nascent sense of hope that had been dormant for so long. The reality of barbed wire and armed guards returned, but it felt different now, somehow less oppressive. Back in the dimly lit barracks, hushed conversations filled the air. The men spoke of the food, the music, and the unexpected kindness they had experienced. They recounted Tex's broken German and his genuine attempts to connect with them. The cookout had been a stark contrast to their preconceived notions of American cruelty. For days, they had steeled themselves for mistreatment, for punishment, for the dehumanization they associated with war. Instead, they had been offered hospitality, laughter, and a glimpse into a culture so different from their own. Hans, the young soldier who had shared his story with Tex, lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The image of his family back in Germany filled his mind, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to truly believe that he might see them again. The cookout had planted a seed of hope, a fragile but persistent belief in a future beyond the war. The following days saw a noticeable shift in the camp's atmosphere. The prisoners were more cooperative, more willing to follow instructions. The resentment that had simmered beneath the surface seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. They worked with a newfound diligence, clearing brush and performing their assigned tasks with a less grudging attitude. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. The guards, too, seemed different. The cookout had humanized the prisoners in their eyes, stripping away the label of enemy and revealing the individuals beneath. They were still soldiers, bound by duty and discipline, but their interactions with the prisoners were now tinged with a hint of empathy. Small acts of kindness, once unthinkable, became commonplace: a shared cigarette, a brief conversation, a helping hand. Sergeant Miller observed the changes with a quiet satisfaction. He had hoped that the cookout would have a positive impact, but he had never imagined the extent of its influence. The camp felt less like a prison and more like a community, albeit one bound by unusual circumstances. He saw the potential for reconciliation, for healing, even in the midst of war. The whispers of hope grew louder, permeating the camp like the scent of sagebrush after a rain. The prisoners dared to dream of peace, of returning home, of rebuilding their lives. The Cowboy cookout had given them a reason to believe in the possibility of a better future, a future where enemies could become friends, and where humanity could triumph over hatred. The impact of that single event resonated throughout the camp, a beacon of light in the darkness of war. The legacy of the Cowboy cookout began to subtly permeate the entire camp. It was no longer just a singular event, it transformed into a whispered legend, a symbol of the possibility of kindness flourishing even amidst the stark realities of war. The story traveled from barrack to barrack, shared in hushed tones during the long desert nights. Each retelling seemed to amplify the unexpected generosity displayed, the shared laughter, and the fleeting moments of understanding. It was a beacon, however small, in a landscape of fear and uncertainty. Tex, the unassuming cowboy cook, became an unlikely hero. His simple acts of kindness, previously viewed with suspicion, were now recognized for their genuine compassion. He continued his interactions with the prisoners, undeterred by the initial skepticism. He shared stories of his life on the ranch, of cattle drives and wide open spaces, painting a vivid picture of a life so different from their own, yet undeniably human. He answered their questions about American culture, patiently explaining the traditions and values that shaped his world. He listened with genuine interest to their stories of home, of families left behind, of dreams deferred by the conflict. His influence rippled through the camp, fostering a sense of mutual respect that had been absent before. Sergeant Miller, initially hesitant about the cookout, underwent a significant transformation. Witnessing the positive impact it had on both the prisoners and the guards, he became a staunch advocate for cultural understanding. He began to see the prisoners not as enemy combatants, but as individuals caught in the same tragic circumstances as himself. He started initiating conversations, seeking to bridge the gap between them. He encouraged his fellow guards to treat the prisoners with dignity and respect, reminding them that they were all human beings, regardless of their uniforms or nationalities. He became a champion of empathy, arguing that understanding was the first step towards reconciliation. The war, however, continued its relentless march. But within the confines of that dusty POW camp, something had irrevocably shifted. The prisoners, once filled with resentment and despair, now harbored a flicker of hope. They worked with more diligence, their interactions with the guards were marked by a newfound courtesy, and they dared to dream of a future beyond the barbed wire. The guards, in turn, treated them with greater understanding and compassion, recognizing the shared humanity that bound them together. Eventually, the news arrived. The war was over. The prisoners would be repatriated, returned to their homes and families. There was a mixture of joy and apprehension in the air. Joy at the prospect of freedom, but apprehension about returning to a world irrevocably changed by war. As the day of their departure approached, a small gathering was held. Prisoners and guards stood side by side, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience that had transformed them all. Tex, with his characteristic grin, offered a simple toast, to peace, and to understanding. It was a simple sentiment, but it carried the weight of all they had endured and all they hoped for. The Cookout, now a distant memory, had left an indelible mark. The prisoners boarded the trucks that would take them away, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and sadness. As they drove away from the camp, they carried with them not only the memories of war but also the enduring legacy of a cowboy cookout, a testament to the power of human connection to overcome even the most difficult of circumstances. The desert wind whispered through the empty camp, carrying the echoes of laughter, music, and shared humanity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still prevail. Years drifted by, the harsh desert winds continuing their tireless dance across the American Southwest. Hans, now a man etched with the wisdom and weariness of age, found himself drawn back to a place he never thought he'd see again, the site of the former prisoner of war camp. The barbed wire was long gone, the barracks dismantled, leaving only faint scars on the landscape, whispers of a past that seemed both distant and vividly present. He walked slowly, his weathered hands tracing the outline of where the camp's mess hall once stood, the memories flooding back with a clarity that defied the passage of time. He could almost smell the dust, feel the relentless heat, and hear the echoes of German voices mingling with the drawl of American guards. But it wasn't the harshness of the camp that resonated most profoundly within him. It was the memory of that single, extraordinary day, the cowboy cookout. He closed his eyes, and he could see it all again, the billowing smoke from the makeshift grill, the vibrant colors of the American flag fluttering in the breeze, the hesitant smiles on the faces of his fellow prisoners as they tentatively approached the unfamiliar feast. And then, there was Tex. Hans remembered Tex with a fondness that transcended language and cultural barriers. He saw him not just as a cook, but as a beacon of humanity in a world consumed by conflict. Tex's genuine warmth, his willingness to connect with them despite the chasm of war that separated them, was a revelation. He recalled the way Tex would try to communicate, his broken German peppered with cowboy slang, his eyes twinkling with an infectious good humor. He remembered the taste of the barbecue, a flavor so foreign and yet so comforting, a symbol of shared nourishment and unexpected camaraderie. Tex, in Hans's memory, was a symbol of American kindness and generosity, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, humanity could still prevail. He often wondered what became of Tex, imagining him back on his ranch, tending to his cattle, a silent guardian of the values he so effortlessly embodied. He also wondered about Sergeant Miller, the man who had, against all odds, allowed the cookout to happen, the man who had seen the potential for good where others saw only danger. He knew that they were both instrumental in making that day a reality, a day that had changed his life forever. Years later, surrounded by his grandchildren, Hans would often recount the story of the cowboy cookout. He would tell them not of the battles fought or the ideologies clashed, but of the simple act of sharing a meal, of the power of music to bridge divides, and of the profound impact of a single act of kindness. He would emphasize the importance of empathy and understanding, reminding them that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable differences, human connection was always possible. The story of the cookout became more than just a memory, it became a legacy, a testament to the enduring power of human connection to overcome prejudice and promote peace. It was a reminder that even in the midst of war, even between enemies, the seeds of understanding and compassion could be sown, and that those seeds, with time and care, could blossom into a future where such conflicts might one day be relegated to the history books. The final thought lingers: kindness endures. Now, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Click on the video suggested on the screen to explore another incredible tale of human resilience.